Emily Wilkes had not come to the Harrington ball to make enemies. She had come to survive. But when she heard Samuel Gray's voice carrying across that gilded room, smooth, certain, and utterly wrong, something inside her cracked open like old bone. She set down her glass. She smoothed the front of her worn silk gown, and she walked straight toward the most powerful man in Philadelphia. Every eye in that ballroom followed her. Every breath held. And when she opened her mouth, what came out changed both their lives forever. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel, follow along until the very last word, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The summer of 1815 sat heavy over Philadelphia like a wool coat in August, thick, suffocating, and impossible to shed. The Harrington estate blazed with candlelight and the laughter of people who had never once gone to bed hungry. Crystal chandeliers threw gold across the faces of merchants, bankers, and politicians, all of them certain they were the most important person in any room they entered. Samuel Gray was used to being the most important person in every room. He stood near the far window, a glass of bourbon untouched in his hand, half listening to Charles Aldrich ramble on about the new cotton mills outside Lancaster. Samuel had already toured those mills. He'd already decided they weren't worth his investment. He had the attention of a man who had built his fortune by knowing, within 30 seconds, whether something was worth his time. Most things were not. "The labor costs alone," Aldridge started. "Are irrelevant," Samuel said flatly, "if the output doesn't justify them." Aldridge blinked, swallowed, and nodded, because that was what men did around Samuel Gray. He was 34 years old. He had built 3 textile mills along the Delaware River from almost nothing, from a borrowed mule and $200 his uncle had loaned him before the old man died. He had no family name worth speaking of, no inheritance, no connections in the beginning. What he had was a mind that never stopped calculating, and a will that had never once bent. Philadelphia society had not accepted him quickly. They had tolerated him first, then courted him when it became clear his money was real and multiplying. Now they invited him to their balls and their suppers, and spoke to him with careful deference, as though he were a large dog they hadn't quite figured out yet. He didn't mind. He had long since stopped needing to be liked. "I'm telling you, Gray," Aldridge pressed on, lowering his voice in that conspiratorial way men did when they wanted to sound important. "The Wilkes land out past Germantown. Old Thomas Wilkes is finished. The debts are deeper than anyone knows. If you move now, you could acquire that whole northern tract for a fraction of Wilkes." Samuel repeated the name slowly, as though tasting it. Thomas Wilkes. The man who invested in the Cary shipyard deal 3 years back? The very same. Lost most of it when the yard went under. The rest he gambled away trying to recover. Aldridge shook his head with the practiced sorrow of a man who felt nothing at all. Sad business. But his land is prime, Samuel. Prime. Samuel said nothing. He lifted his bourbon and finally drank. He knew the Wilkes land. He'd had his eye on it for 2 years. A northern tract that bordered the creek, with good elevation and clean water access. Exactly what he needed for his 4th mill. He had sent a letter to Thomas Wilkes 6 months ago, a formal offer, reasonable and fair by any honest measure. The old man had never replied. "His daughter," Aldridge said, and there was something in his tone that made Samuel glance at him sideways. "Emily Wilkes. You know she's here tonight? I don't make it my business to know who is and isn't at a party, Charles." "Well," Aldridge cleared his throat, She has opinions. About your mills. Most people do. No, I mean, she's spoken about them. Publicly. She gave a rather pointed speech at the Ladies' Reform Society last month. Aldridge's mouth twisted with a discomfort he clearly thought he was hiding. Called your practices inhumane. Used the words exploitation and moral rot in the same sentence as your name. Samuel went very still. Not from anger. From something closer to surprise, which was rarer and, for that reason, more irritating. Did she? She did. Aldridge glanced around, as though suddenly nervous about standing so close to the conversation. I thought you should know. Samuel set his glass down on the sill. He had heard criticism before. He had heard it from newspapers and preachers and rival businessmen who cloaked their envy in the language of morality. It washed off him the way water washed off stone. He was not a man who carried other people's words around in his chest, but a woman who had never set foot in one of his mills, standing up in front of a room full of society ladies and declaring him morally rotten. That was something else. That was the kind of thing that, left unanswered, had a way of spreading. And Samuel Gray had not built what he'd built by letting things spread unchecked. He was going to find out who Emily Wilkes was. He found out sooner than he expected. He heard her voice first, clear and carrying, with a kind of precision that came not from training, but from genuine conviction. She was standing near the center of the room, speaking to a small group of women and one very uncomfortable-looking older gentleman. And she was not whispering. The bill failed because the men voting on it have never once asked what it costs a child to stand at a loom for 14 hours, she was saying. They've never asked because they don't want to know. And they don't want to know because knowing would require them to feel something. Samuel stopped. She was not what he'd expected. He had prepared, without quite realizing it, for someone shrill, someone brittle with righteous indignation and drawing-room courage. The kind that dissolved the moment a real man with real power looked them in the eye. Emily Wilkes did not look like she dissolved easily. She was perhaps 23 or 24, slender in a gown that had been carefully maintained but was, to an eye as sharp as Samuel's, at least 2 seasons past its fashionable moment. Her dark hair was pulled back simply, without the elaborate arrangements that framed most of the women's faces tonight. She had a directness to her features, strong brows, a firm jaw, eyes that moved quickly and landed with intention. She was not conventionally pretty in the way Philadelphia society called pretty. She was something more uncomfortable than that. She was interesting. Miss Wilkes, the older gentleman with her, was murmuring, with the pained expression of a man trying to quietly move a fire away from the curtains. Perhaps this isn't the evening. When is the evening then, Mr. Hartley? She asked, and her voice was not unkind, just honest in a way that cut right through politeness. We've been waiting for the right evening for 3 years. Meanwhile, the mills run all night, and the boys inside them are 9 years old. Samuel moved before he'd made a decision to move. It was not something he was accustomed to, acting without calculation. It happened rarely enough that he noticed it happening, with a slight irritation, even as he continued forward. He came to the edge of her circle. The women saw him first, and the ones who recognized him went quiet, in the particular way that people went quiet around money and consequence. The older gentleman, Hartley, saw him and blanched. Emily Wilkes was still talking. And if the men who profit from it won't speak plainly about what they're doing, then the rest of us— Miss Wilkes, Hartley said, with a desperation that was almost artistic. She stopped, looked at him, followed his gaze, and turned to face Samuel Gray. For a moment, neither of them spoke. She didn't flinch. He noticed that immediately, catalogued it, filed it away. Most people, when they turned around and found him standing behind them, had some kind of physical reaction. A straightening, a softening, a step backward. She did none of those things. She simply looked at him, and there was a quality to her looking that was, against every reasonable expectation, entirely unimpressed. "Mr. Gray," she said. It was not a greeting. It was an identification, the way you'd name a storm that had just walked through the door. "Miss Wilkes," he matched her tone exactly. "I understand you've been speaking about my mills." "I have." "I'd be curious what you base your observations on, given that I don't believe you've ever visited one." Something shifted in her expression. Not embarrassment, which was what he'd expected, but something closer to focus, like a woman who had been waiting for a particular question and was glad it had finally arrived. "I base them," she said, "on the testimony of 12 families in the Kensington district whose children work in your Millbrook facility. I base them on the account of a woman named Margaret Holt, whose son came home last winter with 3 fingers missing from his right hand because the guard mechanism on one of your carding machines had not been repaired in 4 months. I base them on the public record of your mill's output versus your labor expenditure, which makes it mathematically clear that your profit margin depends on paying people less than what their work is worth." She paused. "Would you like me to continue, or would that be sufficient?" The room had gone very, very quiet. Samuel heard it. The held breath of 40 people who had suddenly decided that the most interesting thing happening at the Harrington Ball was this conversation, right here, right now. He should have been angry. By any normal calculation, he should have been cold and cutting and efficient in the way he dismantled her, because he had dismantled better-prepared critics in more formal settings than this. Instead, he said, "The Holt incident. Yes. That machine was taken out of service within 48 hours of the accident and replaced. After the boy lost his fingers. Yes." He didn't look away. After the boy lost his fingers, something flickered across her face. Not victory, closer to grief. "And that," she said quietly, "is the answer to every question anyone asks you, isn't it? You fix the problem after it's already cost someone something they can't get back." The silence around them had the particular texture of a room full of people trying not to breathe too loudly. Samuel Gray had not, in a very long time, been without an answer. He was without one now. He recovered quickly. He always recovered quickly. But the half-second it took was enough, and she saw it, and he saw her see it, and something passed between them in that recognition that was more honest than anything else that had happened in the Harrington estate all evening. "You're Thomas Wilkes's daughter," he said. "I am." "He's never responded to my letter." "He won't." Her chin lifted just slightly. "He asked me to tell you, if I ever found myself in a position to do so, that the Wilkes land is not for sale. Not to you. Not at any price." "Everything has a price, Miss Wilkes." "That," she said, and her voice had gone very even, very still, "is exactly the kind of thing a man says when he has never had to choose between his dignity and his survival." Someone in the room actually drew an audible breath. Samuel looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. The chandeliers threw their gold across both their faces, and neither of them blinked. "Well," said Charles Aldridge, from somewhere behind Samuel's left shoulder, with the voice of a man watching a building burn and not quite sure whether to run toward it or away from it. "This is quite a party." Nobody laughed. Samuel took one step back. It was a deliberate step, controlled, measured. Not a retreat, but a recalibration. He inclined his head toward her, just slightly, in a gesture that was technically a courtesy and contained, if you knew how to read him, something more complicated than that. "Miss Wilkes," he said. "Mr. Gray," she said. He turned and walked away. He did not pick up his bourbon from the windowsill. He did not resume his conversation with Aldridge. He moved through the gilded room and out through the side corridor, and stood for a moment in the quieter dark of the hallway, where the music was muffled and the air was cooler, and he could think. He thought. He thought about the Holt boy. He had not, in truth, thought about the Holt boy in a long time. He had received the report, made the decision to replace the machine, ensured the family received a payment, a generous one, as those things went, and moved on. Because that was what you did. You solved the problem in front of you, and you moved forward. There was always a next problem. There was always forward. He thought about Margaret Holt holding a 9-year-old boy with 4 fingers. He thought about a woman in a worn silk dress who had stood in a ballroom full of people who mattered enormously to her financial future, face down the one man who held the most leverage over what was left of her family's standing, and had not once looked like she wanted to be anywhere else. He thought, that is either the most foolish thing I've seen in years, or the bravest. He was not entirely certain there was a difference. He went home at 10:30, earlier than he'd intended. His housekeeper, Mrs. Daly, a stout woman from Cork, who had been with him for 6 years and treated his moods with the cheerful indifference of someone who had survived actual catastrophe, met him at the door with his evening coat. "Early night, Mr. Gray." "Yes." "Good party?" He thought about it for a moment longer than the question deserved. "Interesting," he said. Mrs. Daly had learned, over 6 years, that this was his word for things that had gotten under his skin. She did not press him. She took his coat, handed him the evening's correspondence, and told him his supper was in the study if he wanted it. He went to the study. He sat down. He looked at the correspondence without reading it. He picked up the top letter, set it down, picked it up again. It was a report from his mill manager at Millbrook, Henderson, a competent and relentlessly cheerful man who sent weekly updates with the thoroughness of someone who had been told once to be thorough and had decided to make it his entire personality. Samuel usually read these reports in under 3 minutes. Tonight he found himself actually reading. 31 workers under the age of 14. Henderson listed them by name, which Samuel had never required him to do. He'd started doing it on his own, sometime in the last year, and Samuel had never commented on it one way or the other. 31 children. He read their names, some of them twice. He set the report down. He stood up, walked to the window, stood there for a while in the summer dark, listening to the city settle into night. He had built his mills because he believed in what they were. He believed in the future they were making. A new kind of America, where a man's birth didn't determine his ceiling, where work and intelligence and will could carry you to places inheritance had never taken anyone. He believed this with the bone-deep conviction of someone who had proved it true in his own life. He was living proof. And the mills were part of that. The mills created work. The mills created goods. The mills created wages for families who would have had nothing otherwise. He had told himself this so many times it had become something he no longer questioned. Like the existence of gravity. Like the color of the sky. But 31 names. But a boy with 4 fingers. But a woman in a worn silk gown who had looked him square in the eye and said, "You fix the problem after it's already cost someone something they can't get back." He pressed his hand flat against the window glass and felt the night heat bleeding through it. He did not sleep well that night. This, too, was unusual. He spent the next 3 days doing what he always did when something had unsettled him. He worked. He had meetings with his financial agent, reviewed the plans for the 4th mill, corresponded with his lumber supplier in Virginia, and managed, by the second day, to go a full 4 hours without thinking about Emily Wilkes. On the morning of the third day, she showed up at his mill. Henderson came to find him in the counting room, where Samuel was going over the Millbrook ledgers with the kind of focused attention that usually made his staff find other places to be. "Mr. Gray," Henderson's voice had a careful quality that immediately pulled Samuel's attention up from the numbers. "There's a woman at the gate." Samuel looked at him. "A Miss Wilkes," Henderson continued. "Emily Wilkes. She says she'd like to tour the facility. She says—" He paused, apparently deciding to deliver the next part quickly. "She says you told her she'd never visited, and so she's come to visit." Samuel was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. "Show her in," he said. Henderson blinked. "Sir?" "Show her in, Henderson." He found her standing just inside the mill yard, looking up at the main building with the expression of someone who had prepared themselves for something and was now confronting whether their preparation was adequate. She was wearing a plain cotton dress today, sensible shoes, her hair tied back practically. She had a small notebook in one hand. She saw him coming and did not look surprised, which told him she had expected him to come himself rather than sending someone. "Mr. Gray," she said. "Miss Wilkes," he stopped a few feet away. "This was not what I meant." "I know." She met his eyes. "I came anyway." "You could have sent a letter requesting a formal tour. Would you have agreed to one?" He didn't answer that, which was, in its own way, an answer. "You have your notebook," he said. "I do." "What are you planning to write in it?" "What I see," she said simply. "Nothing more, nothing less." He studied her for a moment. The morning light was honest, and she stood in it without adjustment, without performance. There was something about her stillness that he found, despite himself, difficult to look away from. It was not the stillness of fear or deference. It was the stillness of someone who had decided what they believed and had made their peace with the cost of it. "Come then," he said. He took her through the mill himself, which was not something he had planned to do, and which created a ripple of surprise among his workers that he could feel without seeing. Henderson trailed at a respectful distance, close enough to be useful, far enough to be politely absent. Emily Wilkes moved through the mill like someone who had come to understand something, not to confirm something she already believed. She looked at the machines. She looked at the workers. She looked at the children. She stopped at a loom where a boy of perhaps 10 was working, his hands moving with the automatic certainty of someone who had done the same task so many times it had become a kind of muscle memory rather than a choice. "What's your name?" she asked him. The boy looked up, looked at Samuel. Samuel gave him a small nod. "Daniel, miss," the boy said. "How long have you worked here, Daniel?" 2 years, miss." "Do you go to school?" A pause. "Used to, miss. Before my pa got sick." Emily wrote something in her notebook. Her face was composed, but her hand, Samuel noticed, had tightened around the pencil. She looked up at Samuel. He held her gaze. 2 years, she said quietly. "He's been here 2 years, Mr. Gray. He's 10 years old." "I know how old he is." "Do you know his father is sick?" "I know his father works in the dye house, and has done since before Daniel started." Something moved across her face. Surprise, quickly reabsorbed. "You know his family?" "I know most of my workers' situations." "And yet—" She stopped herself, looked back at Daniel, who was watching them both with the wariness of a child who had learned to read adult tension quickly. She gave him a small smile. "Thank you, Daniel." The boy looked uncertain. Then, slowly, he smiled back. They moved on. At the end of the tour, they stood outside in the mill yard, and the summer heat settled around them, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Somewhere inside, a machine was running. Somewhere, 31 children were working. "You're not what I expected," Emily said finally. "Neither are you," he said. She looked at him with that direct, unsettling gaze. "What did you expect?" "Someone louder," he said. "Someone angrier." "I'm angry," she said. "I'm just not loud about it." "What's the difference?" She thought about it for a moment. "Loud anger wants to be heard. Quiet anger wants to change something." He stood with that for a second. "Miss Wilkes," he said, "what is it exactly that you want?" She didn't hesitate. "I want Daniel to go to school." "One boy." "One boy," she agreed. "And then another. And then another after that. That's how anything changes, Mr. Gray. One thing at a time until it's changed." He looked at her. The summer light was relentless and honest, and she stood in it the same way she'd stood in the ballroom 3 nights ago. Without armor, without pretense, with nothing but the absolute certainty of someone who had decided that the truth was worth the cost of telling it. Samuel Gray, who had not been uncertain about a business decision in 6 years, found himself uncertain. He said, "I'll think about what you've said." She studied him. "That's what men say when they mean no." "I mean, I'll think about it." She held his gaze for a long moment, as though measuring something. Then she nodded, once, and tucked her notebook under her arm. "Good day, Mr. Gray." "Good day, Miss Wilkes." She walked back through the mill yard and out through the gate, and Samuel watched her go, and he did not look away until she was entirely out of sight. Then he stood there alone in the summer heat, in the noise and the dust of everything he'd built, and he thought about Daniel's hands moving over the loom with that terrible, practiced certainty. And he thought, one thing at a time, until it's changed. And something, in the deep and long-locked place where Samuel Gray kept the things he refused to examine, shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. He sent for Henderson that same afternoon. Not tomorrow. Not in the morning. That afternoon, while the summer dust was still settling in the mill yard, and the memory of Emily Wilkes's voice was still sitting in his chest like something he hadn't figured out how to dislodge. Henderson appeared in the doorway of the counting room, with the expression of a man who had learned that being summoned quickly by Samuel Gray was never entirely a comfortable experience. "Sit down," Samuel said. Henderson sat. "Daniel." Samuel set down his pen. "The boy at the East Loom. 10 years old, father works the dye house." Henderson nodded slowly. "Daniel Marsh, sir. Good worker, quick learner. Is there a school in the Kensington district?" Henderson blinked. "There's a church school, yes. Runs Monday through Friday mornings." "What would it cost to pay the boy's wages while he attends?" The silence that followed had a particular quality. The kind that happened when a man was trying very hard not to look as surprised as he felt. "Sir?" "His wages, Henderson. If the boy goes to school mornings, his family still needs the income. What does he earn a week?" 40 cents, sir." "Then we pay 40 cents a week from the mill account, and he goes to school." Samuel picked his pen back up. "Find out how many others are his age or younger, and bring me the same information for each of them by Thursday." Henderson did not move. "Is there something unclear?" Samuel asked. "No, sir." Henderson stood, paused. "Mr. Gray, is this because of the woman, Miss Wilkes?" Samuel looked up from the ledger. Henderson had the good sense to look immediately as though he hadn't asked the question. "Thursday," Samuel said. "Yes, sir." He left quickly. Samuel stared at the page in front of him. The numbers swam for a moment, which was something that never happened, and he pressed the heel of his hand against his eye and told himself it was the heat. It was not entirely the heat. Emily did not know what she had expected to accomplish by going to the mill. She had told herself it was about evidence, about seeing the conditions for herself rather than relying solely on the accounts of others, however credible those accounts were. She had told herself it was about being able to speak with authority when she stood before the Ladies' Reform Society next month. She had told herself, very firmly, that it had nothing to do with Samuel Gray's face when she'd said, "You fix the problem after it's already cost someone something they can't get back." She had not entirely believed herself, but she had gone anyway. Now she sat at the writing desk in her father's study. Her father was asleep upstairs, as he was most afternoons now, the doctor's tonic keeping him in that soft-edged half-world between waking and rest. And she read back over the notes in her small book and tried to think clearly. Daniel Marsh, age 10. 2 years at the loom. She had written his name 3 times on 3 different pages, which told her something about the state of her concentration. She heard the front door. Their housekeeper, a thin, anxious woman named Clara, who had stayed on even after her wages went to half because she had nowhere else to go, knocked at the study door and opened it before Emily could answer. "There's a man at the door, miss. A Mr. Henderson. Says he works for Samuel Gray." Emily's pen stopped moving. "He says he has a message." She set the pen down carefully, stood, smoothed the front of her dress in the way she always did when she needed a moment to make her face do what she wanted it to do. "Send him in," she said. Henderson was a broad-shouldered man with an honest face and the slightly hurried manner of someone perpetually behind on something. He held his hat in both hands and looked at her with the careful respect of a person who had been told to be respectful and had actually listened. "Miss Wilkes, I'm William Henderson, floor manager at Mr. Gray's Millbrook facility. I apologize for calling without notice. What's the message, Mr. Henderson?" He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. "From Mr. Gray, miss. He asked me to deliver it personally." She took it, did not open it, looked at Henderson. "Is he expecting a reply?" He said whatever you wished to send back, or nothing, was entirely your decision. She unfolded the paper. The handwriting was precise and angular. The handwriting of someone who had taught himself to write as an adult, she thought, with the discipline of a man who believed that everything worth doing was worth doing exactly right. It said, "Daniel Marsh will begin attending the Kensington Church School Monday morning. 40 cents weekly will be drawn from mill accounts to maintain his family's income. I am meeting with Henderson Thursday to assess the same arrangement for other children of similar age. This is not a negotiation. It is not a gesture. I don't make gestures. S. Gray." She read it twice. Then she folded it back along its original lines precisely, and she looked at Henderson, who was watching her with that careful, honest face. "Tell him," she said, and stopped. She thought for a moment. "Tell him I said, 1 thing at a time." Henderson nodded as though this made perfect sense. "Yes, miss." After he left, she stood in the middle of the study for a long time without moving. Clara appeared at the door, took one look at her face, and silently retreated. Emily pressed the folded letter against her sternum, just once, and breathed. She did not let herself feel too much about it. She had learned, in the 3 years since her father's losses had begun compounding like interest on a debt that could never be repaid, that feeling too much about small victories was dangerous. Because the small victories almost always came with complications she hadn't yet seen. This one was no different. The complication arrived 3 days later, in the form of Charles Aldridge. Emily had gone to the market on Chestnut Street, the kind of errand she did now that they'd let the last of their household help go, except Clara. and she was standing at the flower merchant's stall negotiating the price of a 20-pound sack when she heard his voice behind her. "Miss Wilkes?" She turned. Aldridge was standing 2 feet away, dressed with the elaborate care of a man who believed that clothing was a form of argument. He had 2 other men with him. She didn't know their names, but she knew their type. The kind of Philadelphia men who existed at the edges of other men's money, always angling toward the center. "Mr. Aldridge," she said. "What a pleasant surprise." His smile did not reach his eyes. It never reached his eyes. She'd noticed this about him at the Harrington ball. "How is your father?" "He's well, thank you." "Is he?" Aldridge tilted his head in the way of a man conveying doubt without committing to it. "I'd heard he'd been unwell. The business with the Cary shipyard, I mean. That kind of financial shock. It takes a toll on a man. My father is resilient." "Of course he is." He paused, and in the pause she felt the thing he was actually here to say begin to take shape. "I wondered, Miss Wilkes, purely out of concern, you understand, whether you'd given any more thought to Mr. Gray's original offer. For the land. The land isn't for sale." "Yes, you mentioned that at the Harrington ball. Quite forcefully." His smile stayed exactly where it was. "But the thing is, Miss Wilkes, your father's creditors have been speaking with certain parties in the city. And the situation, as I understand it, may be more pressing than—" "What parties?" she said. His smile didn't waver. "Just interested parties. Mr. Aldridge." She picked up her flour sack and settled it against her hip, and looked at him with the directness she'd practiced on men like him since she was 19 years old. "If you have something to say to my father about his debts, you say it to my father. If you're here to suggest that I pressure him to sell the only asset we have left to a man who wants it for a mill, I'd ask you to say so plainly. I don't do well with implication." One of the men at Aldridge's shoulder made a small sound, almost amusement, quickly suppressed. Aldridge's smile went slightly rigid. "I'm simply trying to help." "You're trying to help yourself to a finder's fee," she said. "Good day, Mr. Aldridge." She walked away. She walked 2 full blocks before she let herself stop at the corner and stand very still and breathe through the anger that was moving through her like floodwater, looking for somewhere to go. The creditors were talking to people, which meant it was worse than her father had told her, which meant she needed to go home and find the ledgers and read every number herself, because Thomas Wilkes, God love him, had a lifetime's habit of protecting her from the full truth of things until the full truth was unavoidable. She went home. She found the ledgers, and the full truth was, in fact, significantly worse than she'd known. She sat with it until midnight, when the candle had burned down to a stub, and her eyes hurt, and her hands were cold despite the summer heat outside. Then she blew out what remained of the light and sat in the dark for a while. The northern tract, 300 acres of good land bordering the creek, land her grandfather had cleared himself, land where she'd learned to ride and where her father had taught her the names of trees on long autumn afternoons before everything went wrong. The land was the only thing standing between the Wilkes family and complete ruin, and it was also, she now understood, not going to stand there much longer. The debt was real. The creditors were real. The note on the property would come due in 8 months, and there was nothing, no investment, no income, no reserve, nothing that could meet it. Unless... She pressed her fingers against her eyes. Unless she sold the land. Samuel Gray's offer had been $12,000. She had seen the number in her father's correspondence. In the letter he'd never answered. $12,000 would clear every debt, with enough remaining to set them up modestly. Not in the style they'd once known, but in comfort, in safety, in the kind of solid, quiet security that didn't keep you awake at night calculating. $12,000 from the man she'd called morally rotten in front of Philadelphia society. She almost laughed. It came out as something closer to a sound of pain. She went to bed. She did not sleep. In the morning, she wrote Samuel Gray a letter. She wrote it 4 times before she had a version she could send. The first 3 were either too proud or too desperate, and both of those were things she couldn't afford to be. The 4th one said, "Mr. Gray, I believe we should speak again. Not about the mill, and not about the land. I'd ask only for an hour of your time at your convenience. E. Wilkes." She sent it with Clara before she could think better of it. His reply came back within 2 hours, which told her things she wasn't ready to think about too carefully. It said, "Tomorrow, 3 o'clock, my office on Market Street. I'll have tea sent for. S. Gray." She stared at the words, "I'll have tea sent for an unreasonable amount of time. It was such a small thing. It was the kind of small thing that revealed, against a person's will, that they had been thinking about the comfort of someone they'd only met twice. She folded the letter and put it away. The office on Market Street was nothing like she'd expected. She didn't know what she'd expected. Something more aggressively prosperous, perhaps, more designed to impress. Instead, it was a working office, plainly furnished, with the slightly chaotic organization of someone who spent more time thinking than tidying. There were papers on every surface, and a set of architectural drawings pinned to the wall, and a row of ledgers lined up on the shelf with the spines facing out, each one labeled in that same precise, self-taught handwriting. Samuel was standing when she came in. He didn't come around the desk to greet her. He simply looked at her across the room with the same quality of attention she'd noticed at the Harrington ball. The look of a man who processed information quickly and held on to what mattered. "Miss Wilkes," he said. "Sit down." "Thank you." She sat, folded her hands in her lap, did not let herself look at the drawings on the wall, though she wanted to. He sat across from her. There was a tea service on the desk between them, simple white china already poured. Neither of them touched it. "You said not about the mill," he said, "and not about the land." "I lied," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the place where a smile lived when it wasn't happening yet. "About which part?" he asked. "The land," she said. "I need to talk about the land." The not-quite smile disappeared. "Miss Wilkes, my father is more unwell than I told anyone." The words came out flat and clean, because she had decided on the walk over that the only way she could do this was to be entirely precise. "The debts against the property are real and significant, and the note comes due in 8 months. I have had one night to sit with a full picture of it, and what I can see, Mr. Gray, is that the land is going to be lost regardless. The question is whether we lose it to you, at your price, on terms I might be able to negotiate some dignity into, or whether we lose it to the creditors at whatever price they can get for it at a forced sale." The room was very quiet. "I'm telling you this," she continued, "because you are apparently a man who can handle being told the truth plainly, and because I have no taste whatsoever for letting people lead me into positions through implication when they could have just said what they meant from the start." Samuel was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. It was not the cool, calculating look from the ballroom. It was not the watchful, measured look from the mill. It was something quieter than both of those. Something that made her want to look away, which she did not do. "Your father," he said. "Does he know you're here?" "No." "Why not?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because if I tell him I'm considering selling the land, it will break something in him that hasn't broken yet, and I'm not ready for that." Samuel picked up his tea, set it down without drinking. A small, unconscious gesture that told her he was thinking. "Aldridge came to see you," he said. It wasn't a question. She looked at him sharply. "How do you know that?" "Because Aldridge came to see me the morning after the Harrington ball, with a proposal to act as intermediary on a land acquisition. I told him I wasn't interested in an intermediary." His voice was level. "I should have guessed he'd go directly to you." He implied the creditors were already circling. "They are." Samuel met her eyes. "I'm one of them." The silence that followed had actual weight. "What?" she said. "The note on your father's property." His voice was completely even, the way a man's voice went when he was being careful about every word. "One of the creditors sold his portion 18 months ago. I purchased it. I have been waiting." "Waiting," she repeated, "for Thomas Wilkes to come to the table. He didn't know it was you." "No. It was handled through an agent." She stared at him. The thing moving through her chest was not a single emotion. It was 5 or 6 at once, and she was sorting through them quickly, trying to find the right one to lead with. "You've been holding a note on our land," she said, slowly, precisely, while simultaneously making offers to purchase it through the front door. "Yes." "That's—" She stopped. "Strategic," he said. "I was going to say something less polite." "I know." She stood up. She was not sure she'd decided to stand, but her body had apparently made the decision ahead of her mind, because she was on her feet and the chair was behind her, and Samuel was watching her with an expression that was very carefully not apologetic, and also very carefully not indifferent. "Miss Wilkes, you let me stand in front of you at that mill," she said, and her voice was low and very controlled, which was, in her experience, more frightening than loud. "And talk about honesty, about saying things plainly, about fixing problems before they cost people something they can't get back." She picked up her gloves from the desk. "And all the while, you had a legal claim over my family's home. The two things aren't— Don't tell me the two things aren't related," she said. "You are an intelligent man. Don't pretend you don't understand why they're related." He was quiet. She pulled on one glove, then the other. "I came here today," she said, "because I thought you were someone I could speak plainly with. Someone who valued plain speech the way I do. And maybe you are that person in some rooms." She smoothed the second glove over her fingers. "But in this room, Mr. Gray, you have been, from the very beginning, holding a card I didn't know existed, and I don't do business with people who do that." "What if I offered to sell the note back?" he said. She stopped. "At the original value," he said. "No interest, no profit." She turned. He was still seated, still looking at her with that quiet, unreadable expression. But something in his posture had changed. Something had gone out of it. The certainty, she thought. The absolute bedrock certainty that she associated with everything about him. It had, in this moment, developed a hairline crack. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "Because," he said, and stopped. Started again. "Because you were right. I do fix things after they've already cost someone something they can't get back. And I'm trying to determine whether I'm capable of doing it differently." The room held its breath. Emily looked at Samuel Gray across the tea service and the ledgers and the architectural drawings and the full, complicated wreckage of the past week, and she thought, "This is either the most honest thing anyone has said to me in 3 years, or it's the cleverest negotiation I've ever encountered." She thought, "The terrifying thing is that I am not certain which one it is." And she thought, "The even more terrifying thing is that I'm not sure it matters." "I'll need to see the note," she said. "I'll have it sent to you by morning. And I'll need time to discuss it with my father. Take whatever time you need." She nodded once, picked up her bag, moved toward the door. "Miss Wilkes," he said behind her. She stopped, did not turn. "I didn't buy the note to hurt your family," he said. "I bought it because it was available, and the land was what I needed. At the time, that was the only calculation I was making." She stood there for a moment in the doorway. The summer air from the hallway moved past her, warm and thick. "At the time," she said, "yes." "And now?" She heard him breathe. "Now," he said, "I am making different calculations." She walked out. She made it to the street before her composure cracked, just slightly, around the edges. Not into tears, which was not something she did in public, but into the kind of shaking breath that comes after a person has held themselves absolutely rigid for an hour, and finally, for one private second, lets go. She stood on Market Street in the summer heat and let the city move around her, and she thought about a man who had taught himself to write with the discipline of someone who believed everything worth doing was worth doing right. She thought about 31 names in a ledger. She thought, different calculations. And something in her, quiet and guarded and deeply unwilling to be moved anyway. The note arrived before sunrise. Clara brought it up with the morning water, and Emily sat up in bed and held it without opening it for a full minute, listening to her father cough softly in the room down the hall. A sound that had become so woven into the texture of her mornings that she sometimes couldn't remember what silence had sounded like before it started. She opened the envelope. The note of debt was exactly what Samuel had described. Proper, legal, signed, and stamped. And at the bottom, in that angular, self-taught handwriting, a single added line. "The offer to return this at original value stands without condition or time limit. Do with it what you will. S. Gray." She read that last line 3 times. Without condition or time limit. She folded the document carefully, placed it inside the cover of the heaviest book on her nightstand, and went downstairs to make her father's breakfast herself, because Clara's hands had been shaking again, and Emily had decided 2 weeks ago not to notice it out loud. She did not tell her father about the note. Not yet. He was having a clear morning, alert, almost like himself, eating his porridge with the focused contentment of someone whose world had narrowed to manageable size. She sat across from him and watched his hands around the spoon, and thought about 300 acres of land, and 8 months, and different calculations. "You're quiet," her father said. "I'm always quiet at breakfast." "You're quieter than you're quiet." He looked at her with eyes that were still, even through the fog of illness and loss and tonic, the sharpest eyes she'd ever known. "What's happened?" "Nothing's happened, Papa." "Emily." She met his gaze, held it, then looked down at her own cup. "I've been thinking about the land," she said. The silence that followed had the particular weight of something that had been waiting a long time to arrive. "No," her father said. "Papa." "I said no." His voice didn't rise. It never rose. It went the other direction. Quieter, more absolute. "Your grandfather built that house with his own hands. Your grandmother is buried on that hill. I will not. We're going to lose it regardless," she said. The words sat between them. Her father set down his spoon. His hands, she noticed, were not shaking. They were very still, which was somehow worse. "How bad is it?" he asked. "Bad enough that I went to see Samuel Gray." His face moved through several expressions in rapid succession. Surprise, anger, something that looked uncomfortably like shame, before settling into the stillness of a man who had run out of room to argue. "He holds part of the note," Emily said. "He's offered to return it at cost. Why would he do that?" "I don't entirely know," she said honestly, "but I believe him." Her father was quiet for a long time. Outside, a cart rumbled past on the cobblestones. Somewhere up the street, a child was calling to another child, and the sound of it was so ordinary and clean that it made Emily's chest ache for no reason she could name. "You believe him," her father repeated. "Yes." "Why?" She thought about Daniel Marsh at the loom. She thought about 31 names in a ledger. She thought about a man standing in the summer heat of a mill yard saying, "I am trying to determine whether I am capable of doing it differently." "Because he's doing things that cost him something," she said. "And in my experience, that's the only reliable test of whether a person means what they say." Her father looked at her for a long time. Then he picked his spoon back up. "Let me think," he said. "Take as long as you need," she said. She meant it. But she also knew, from the set of his shoulders and the way he'd gone back to his porridge, methodical, mechanical, not tasting, that the thinking was already done, and what came next was just the grief of accepting it. She didn't go back to see Samuel. She told herself it was because her father needed time, and she needed to let him have it. That was true. It was also true that she was not entirely sure she trusted the particular quality of her own thinking when Samuel Gray was in the same room. This was a new problem, and she was not pleased to have it. She went instead to the Ladies' Reform Society, where she was supposed to deliver a report on mill conditions for the monthly meeting. She had her notes. She had her arguments. She had, thanks to the tour of Millbrook, a specific and unassailable account of what she'd seen with her own eyes. What she had not anticipated was Margaret Holt being there. Margaret Holt was a small woman, perhaps 40, with a particular economy of movement that came from decades of managing everything with not quite enough. She was sitting in the third row when Emily came in, and she looked up when Emily entered. And Emily knew immediately who she was before anyone said a word, because the woman's right hand, resting in her lap, was holding her left. And in the gap between her fingers, Emily could see the small, scarred hand of a boy sitting close beside his mother. Her son. 8 fingers. 14 months since the accident. Emily stopped in the doorway. Mrs. Holt looked at her with an expression that was not hostile and not warm, but something precise and direct and waiting. "Miss Wilkes," said Mrs. Carleton, who ran the society with the organizational ferocity of a general and the social polish of an ambassador. "We're just about to begin." "Mrs. Holt," Emily said. She crossed the room. She crouched down, actually crouched down, which made several women in the room shift uncomfortably, so that she was at eye level with the boy. "Is this your son?" "This is James," Margaret Holt said. Her voice was flat and careful. "James?" Emily looked at him. He was looking back at her with the wary, old-eyed look of a child who had learned to read adults for signs of danger. "I heard you were very brave." He said nothing. He tucked his hand tighter under his mother's. Emily stood. She looked at Margaret Holt directly. "I went to the mill last week. I took notes. I spoke to the manager." She paused. "I've been corresponding with the owner." Something shifted in Margaret Holt's face. "Mr. Gray?" "Yes." "And?" "He's sending children to school, starting Monday." The room had gone very quiet. It did that around Emily, in a way that still surprised her sometimes. The way a room full of women, who were used to deferring, would suddenly stop and listen when someone spoke without apology. "Just sending them to school," Margaret said, "while James still has 8 fingers." "Yes," Emily said. "I know." "He sent us money," Margaret said. "After. $120. It came in an envelope with no name." Her voice didn't break. It was more like the way stone sounds when there's tension running through it, held together by its own weight. "We used 70 of it for the doctor, 30 for winter food, 20 I put away because I couldn't stand to spend it, and I couldn't stand to throw it away." Emily didn't say anything. There was nothing useful to say. "Is he a good man, Miss Wilkes?" Margaret asked. "Or is he a man who does good things when they're made inconvenient enough for him not to?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Emily looked at her. "I'm not sure yet," she said. "But I think that may be exactly the question worth asking him." She wrote him that afternoon. This time, the letter said, "Mr. Gray, I would like you to meet someone. Her name is Margaret Holt. If you are willing, I will arrange it. If you are not willing, that too is an answer. E. Wilkes." The reply came in 3 hours. "Yes, whatever she needs. S. Gray." She stared at those 4 words for a long time. Whatever she needs. Not, arrange it at your convenience. Not, I'll have Henderson handle the details. Whatever she needs. She folded the letter and put it with the first one, inside the cover of the heavy book, and she did not examine too closely why she was keeping them there. The meeting happened 4 days later, in the small parlor of the Ladies' Reform Society, because Emily had decided that neutral ground was better than either party's territory, and because Mrs. Carleton, once briefed, had offered the space with the quiet ferocity of someone who understood that certain meetings were history in the making, whether history noticed or not. Samuel arrived first. He always arrived first. She was beginning to understand this about him, that punctuality was a form of respect in his vocabulary, and lateness a form of statement he refused to make. He was standing near the window when Emily came in, and he looked at her with the expression she'd started to recognize as his version of relief. Not effusive, not obvious, just a slight settling in his posture, like something that had been held at a fraction of tension, finally releasing. "She knows who I am?" he asked. "She knows." "Is she—" He stopped. "She's brave," Emily said. "Braver than most people in this city, and she has considerably more reason not to be." He nodded once. Margaret Holt arrived with James. The boy was not wearing his good clothes, which told Emily something about Margaret, that she had decided, deliberately, not to dress him up for this meeting, not to perform suffering, just to arrive as they were. Samuel Gray, who had faced down financiers and politicians and rival industrialists without a flicker of discomfort, looked at James Holt's hand and went absolutely still. James was looking at him with those old, wary eyes. Margaret was looking at Samuel with the expression of a woman who had decided to be present for this, whatever it was, without deciding in advance what she felt about it. The 4 of them stood there for a moment. Then Samuel crouched down, right down, the way Emily had at the society meeting. Not a powerful man bending slightly, but an adult making himself level with a child. "James," he said. His voice was different, quieter, something in it that Emily had not heard before. "My name is Samuel Gray. I own the mill where you were hurt." James looked at him. "I'm sorry," Samuel said. "I should have fixed that machine sooner. I didn't. And you paid for that with something you can't get back." He stopped. "I wanted to tell you that myself, not through anyone else." James looked at his mother. Margaret looked at Samuel. "He's 9, she said. "He doesn't fully understand what 'should have' means yet." "No," Samuel said. He stood. "But I do." The silence between him and Margaret Holt had the quality of 2 people communicating something that language was not quite precise enough to carry. "The money you sent," she said. "Yes." "I still have $20 of it." Her chin lifted. "I don't know what to do with it." "Keep it," he said. "Or give it away. Whatever helps you most." "What helps me most," she said carefully, "is my son going back to school, which he can't do because we need his wages." Samuel looked at her steadily. As of this Monday, children under 12 at Millbrook will be on a school program. Their wages continue. The mill covers the hours they miss. Margaret Holt said nothing. I should have done it sooner, he said. I'm doing it now. Margaret looked at Emily. Emily looked back at her and said nothing, because this was not her moment to shape. It was Margaret's. All right, Margaret Holt said finally. Not warm, not forgiving. Just present and real and willing to take one step forward. All right. James, who had been watching Samuel with those ancient child's eyes throughout, tugged at his mother's sleeve. She looked down at him. Can I go to school Monday? He asked. Something crossed Margaret Holt's face that was too complicated to name and too private to witness, and Emily looked away from it deliberately to give the woman a second of grace. Yes, Margaret said. Yes, baby. Monday. Emily walked out with Samuel afterward, into the summer heat of the street, and they walked without any particular destination for half a block before either of them spoke. She didn't forgive you, Emily said. No, he said. Does that bother you? He thought about it with the serious consideration he gave to things that deserved serious consideration. No, he said again. I didn't go there for forgiveness. Forgiveness is about what I need. That wasn't the point. She looked at him sideways. What was the point? To look at him, Samuel said. To look at what I'd done and not look away from it. She stopped walking. He stopped too, turned, looked at her with those clear, calculating eyes that she was slowly learning contained, underneath all the calculation, a quality she hadn't expected. A capacity for pain that had been so thoroughly managed and compartmentalized that it had almost ceased to be visible. Almost. Samuel, she said. It was the first time she'd used his given name, and they both noticed it. He didn't react, but his posture changed in the way she'd learned to read, that small release of held tension. What happened to your wife? She asked. He looked at her for a long moment. Her name was Catherine, he said. We were married 2 years. She was... He stopped, started again. She was the first person who ever made me feel like the man I was trying to become was actually worth becoming. And she died in the 3rd month of a pregnancy she hadn't yet told me about. And I wasn't there because I was in Lancaster looking at a mill site. Emily didn't say anything. I have never told anyone that, he said. In 6 years. I know, she said. She didn't know how she knew, but she did. You could tell, from the way the words came out clean and stripped down, without the practiced smoothness of things that had been said before. I built the mills after she died, he said. I built them because I needed something to do with my hands that was large enough to fill the size of what was gone. He was looking at the middle distance now, not at her. And somewhere in the building of them, I stopped asking certain questions. Because asking those questions would have cost me momentum, and momentum was the only thing I had instead of... He stopped. Instead of what? She asked quietly. Instead of her, he said. The street moved around them. A cart. 2 women with parasols. A boy selling newspapers. The whole ordinary summer life of Philadelphia, carrying on with total indifference to the 2 people standing still in the middle of it. Emily felt something in her chest that she recognized distantly as dangerous. The specific danger of caring about someone you hadn't planned to care about. The way it happened without your permission, in pieces, through small moments rather than dramatic ones. Until you looked up one day and the caring was simply there, fully formed, and the only question remaining was what you intended to do about it. My father is going to sell you the land, she said. Samuel looked at her. He told me this morning. He wants it done properly, a fair negotiation, no pressure, his lawyer present. She met his eyes. He also said, and I'm quoting directly, that if you try to be clever about it, he will find the energy to haunt you from beyond the grave, which, at his current rate of health, he thinks might be sooner than either of us would prefer. Something broke open in Samuel Gray's face. It was only there for a second, a sudden, unguarded crack through which something warm and wholly undefended briefly appeared before the composure settled back over it. But she saw it. She saw it, and she filed it away in the same place she'd been filing all the other things she'd noticed about him that she wasn't ready to name. "He sounds like someone worth knowing," Samuel said. "He is," she said. "He's also someone who made a great many mistakes and didn't always protect the people he loved from the cost of them." She looked at him steadily. "Sound familiar?" He held her gaze. "Yes." "Good," she said, "because I find that men who recognize their own failures in other people are considerably less likely to repeat them." "Is that a scientific principle, Miss Wilkes?" "It's an observation," she said, "from a woman who has been watching people very carefully for a very long time." They stood there on the Philadelphia street in the July heat, and the space between them had the quality that space sometimes got when two people were standing as close as practicality allowed, and both of them were very aware of it. Then Aldridge stepped out of a building 20 feet away. He saw them at the same moment they saw him. His eyes moved from Emily to Samuel and back to Emily with the quick, assessing calculation of a man who stored information the way other men stored money, for future leverage. "Gray," he said, nodding. "Miss Wilkes." His smile was exactly the same as it had been at the market, fixed and not quite reaching. "What a coincidence." "Aldridge," Samuel said. "I heard," Aldridge said pleasantly, "that young Daniel Marsh started at the church school this morning. Very progressive of you, Samuel." "I didn't ask your opinion of it." "No, of course not." Aldridge's gaze slid to Emily again, and there was something in it now that she hadn't caught before. A calculation, specific and pointed, like a man who had just added a column of numbers and found the total useful. "I was just speaking with Judge Harmon this morning, as a matter of fact, about the Wilkes property. He seems to think—" "Whatever Harmon thinks," Samuel said, and his voice had gone to the flat, particular coldness she'd first heard at the Harrington ball, "is not your business to carry around the city." "Oh, I'm just making conversation," Aldridge smiled. "But you should know, Miss Wilkes, the other creditors on that note are not as patient as our friend Gray here. And there are parties interested in that northern tract who are prepared to move considerably faster than any—" "Who?" Emily said. Aldridge blinked. He hadn't expected the interruption. "Who are these parties?" she said. "Name them." He smiled again. "I'm not really in a position to—" "Then you're not in a conversation," she said. "You're delivering a threat. And I'd thank you to either name the people sending it or stop wasting my time." Aldridge looked at Samuel. Samuel looked back at him with the expression of a man who was deciding how much patience he had left, and had found the answer to be very little. "I'll be on my way," Aldridge said. He walked, briskly. Emily watched him go. She could feel Samuel standing beside her, and she could feel the shift in him, the sharpening, the way his thinking had changed direction as cleanly as a river hitting rock. "He knows something," Samuel said. "He always knows something," she said. "He makes it his business." "The other creditors." Samuel's voice was careful. "I own the largest portion of the note. The remaining balance is split between 3 others. I thought they were content to wait." He paused. "If someone has approached them—" "Then they're not waiting anymore," Emily said. He turned to look at her. His face had that quality again, the one she'd seen when he'd looked at James Holt's hand. Not cold, not calculated. Something underneath all of that, raw and immediate. Emily. Her name, without the formal address, without the distance. Just her name. "I know," she said. She already knew what he was going to say. "If the other creditors move before your father signs—" "I know." "We have days," he said. "Maybe less." She looked at him. The summer heat pressed down on both of them, and the city went on around them, and somewhere behind all of it, in a room she couldn't see, men with ledgers and lawyers were moving pieces on a board she was only just beginning to understand the full shape of. "Then we don't waste them," she said. He looked at her for a moment. That clear, unguarded look that lasted only a second, but contained more honesty than most people managed in a year. "No," he said. "We don't." They had 3 days. Samuel knew this the way he knew mill output figures and ledger balances. Not as an estimate, but as a fact he had calculated from every available angle, and found the same answer each time. 3 days before the secondary creditors could be organized, lawyered, and legally positioned to force a sale. 3 days before Aldridge, who was nobody's friend and everybody's instrument, could finish whatever arrangement he was building in the background. He spent the first evening calling in every favor he was owed in Philadelphia's legal community, which was considerable. He sent his own attorney, a sharp-minded man named Prescott, to file a formal hold on the note proceedings, pending renegotiation. It would buy time, not much, but enough. Then he sat down and wrote a letter to Thomas Wilkes himself, not through Emily, not through Henderson or Prescott or any intermediary. He wrote it himself, at his desk, at 9:30 at night. And he wrote it the way he wrote everything that mattered. Plain and direct and without ornament. It said, "Mr. Wilkes, my name is Samuel Gray. You know who I am and what I want, and I won't waste your time pretending otherwise. I also won't waste it with anything less than the full truth, which is this. You have approximately 72 hours before the other parties, holding portions of your note, move to force a sale at whatever price they can get. I can prevent that. I intend to prevent it, regardless of whether you sell me the land. Because your daughter told me you deserve a fair negotiation, and I have come to trust her judgment on most things. I would like to meet with you tomorrow morning, if you're well enough to receive me. Bring your lawyer. I'll bring mine. Samuel Gray." He sent it with his fastest runner and went to bed and slept better than he had in 2 weeks, which told him something about the specific relief of having made a decision and committed to it entirely. Thomas Wilkes received him at 9 o'clock. Emily met Samuel at the door. She was wearing the plain cotton dress again, the practical one, and her hair was back simply, and she looked at him with an expression that contained a full conversation's worth of information, compressed into 1 second. "Are you sure?" "Yes, I'm sure." "All right then. Let's go." "He's in the parlor," she said. "He had a good night." "Good." "Samuel." She said his name the way she'd said it on the street yesterday, without the formal address, without ceremony, just the name, which somehow contained more weight than any title she might have attached to it. "He's going to be difficult." "I'd expect nothing less from a man who raised you." Something moved across her face, not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. She stepped back from the door. Thomas Wilkes was sitting in a chair by the parlor window, and he was not, Samuel noted immediately, what he'd expected. He'd expected a diminished man. A man worn down by loss and illness, into something pale and reduced. What he found instead was a man who had been diminished by circumstance, but not by character. Upright in his chair, clear-eyed in a way that cut through the fog his illness had otherwise settled over him. Looking at Samuel Gray, the way a man looked at something he decided to take the full measure of. "Mr. Gray," he said. His voice was thinner than it had probably once been, but it was steady. "Mr. Wilkes." Samuel sat down without being invited to, which he decided in advance was the right approach. Not disrespectful, just honest. Equal. "Thank you for seeing me." "I didn't have a great many options," Thomas said dryly. "No, but you could have sent me away anyway, and you didn't." Thomas looked at him for a moment. "Emily says you crouched down to talk to the Holt boy." Samuel said nothing. "She didn't say it like a compliment," Thomas continued. "She said it like a fact, like she was adding it to a list she was keeping." He paused. "My daughter keeps lists. Has since she was 8 years old. I used to think it was a peculiarity. Now I think it might be the most sensible thing about her." "It might be," Samuel agreed. Thomas's lawyer, a careful older man named Webb, was sitting in the corner with his papers in his lap. Prescott was beside Samuel. The four of them occupied the small parlor, with the specific tension of people who had things to settle and intended to settle them. 12,000, Thomas said. "That was your original offer." "Yes." "Webb thinks it's fair." "It is fair." Thomas looked at him with those clear, exhausting eyes. "Why?" Samuel met his gaze. "Because your daughter would know if it wasn't." The parlor went quiet. Thomas Wilkes looked at his lawyer. Webb gave the smallest nod. Thomas looked back at Samuel. "There are conditions," he said. "There usually are. The house on the northern tract, the old stone house where my mother lived." Thomas's voice stayed steady, which Samuel understood was costing him something. "It doesn't transfer with the land. I want it in the agreement that the house and the 2 acres around it remain Wilkes' property." Samuel looked at him. "Done." Thomas blinked. He'd expected a negotiation. The immediate agreement had caught him off guard. And Samuel saw the moment it landed, saw the man's throat move. "Just like that?" Thomas said. "Just like that," Samuel said. "I need the creek access and the northern elevation. I don't need your mother's house." Thomas was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was fractionally less steady than it had been. "And the families, the tenant families on the eastern edge. 3 of them. They've been there since my father's time. Their leases transfer and remain valid for as long as they choose to stay," Samuel said. "At current rates, not adjusted." Thomas Wilkes looked at Samuel Gray with the expression of a man who had prepared for a battle and found instead a conversation. "You already thought about this," Thomas said. "Yes." "Before you came?" "Yes." "Why?" Samuel leaned forward, his forearms on his knees, and he looked at Thomas Wilkes directly. "Because I wanted you to be able to say yes without feeling like you'd lost something that mattered. The land is land. What's on it is yours." The silence that followed was the longest in the room so far. From the hallway, very quietly, came the sound of Emily, not quite managing to be entirely out of earshot. Samuel did not look toward the door. Thomas did not either, but both of them knew she was there, and neither of them mentioned it. "Webb," Thomas said finally. "Draw it up." By noon, the papers were signed. Prescott took them to file. Webb folded his copies with the care of a man who respected documents and what they represented. Thomas Wilkes shook Samuel's hand, a firm handshake, longer than required, the kind that said several things that weren't being said aloud. "She's going to argue with you," Thomas said, "about everything important." "I know," Samuel said. "You'll lose half those arguments." "Probably. The other half you'll only win because she decides to let you." Thomas held his gaze. "I want to be clear about that." "Understood," Samuel said. Something in Thomas's face relaxed. Not fully, because it was not a full relaxation kind of face, but enough. He let go of Samuel's hand. Emily walked them both to the door. Prescott went ahead. Samuel paused on the step and looked back at her. And she was standing in the doorway with her arms folded and her chin lifted, and the expression of someone who had been holding a great deal together for a great deal of time, and was now, carefully, allowing herself to consider the possibility that some of it might be able to be put down. "It's done?" she asked. "It's done." She breathed, just one breath, slow and deliberate. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," he said. "Your father negotiated everything that mattered." The corner of her mouth moved. "He did, didn't he?" "He's a good man." "He made mistakes," she said. "So have I," Samuel said. "So has everyone in that room." She looked at him. The summer light fell between them, and neither of them moved. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," he said, "I go stop Aldridge." He found Aldridge at his club on Walnut Street, which was where Aldridge spent every Tuesday afternoon, because Aldridge was a man of habits, and habits made men predictable. Samuel didn't sit down. He stood across the table from Aldridge and waited until the man looked up from his cards with that practiced, pleasant smile that Samuel had decided he was entirely finished tolerating. "The Wilkes note is settled," Samuel said. "Filed and stamped as of this morning. Whatever you were building with the other creditors is finished." Aldridge set his cards down. "Samuel, I was only trying to—" "I know what you were trying to do." Samuel's voice was quiet. "You've been trying to do it since the night of the Harrington ball. You thought if you pressured the Wilkes family from two directions simultaneously, the land would go to forced sale, and you'd collect a finder's fee from whatever party you'd already promised it to." Aldridge opened his mouth. "Don't," Samuel said. "I've spent 20 years watching men like you work. I know every move before you make it." He leaned forward, just slightly, just enough. "Whoever you've been dealing with on this, whoever wanted that land badly enough to pay you to arrange a forced sale, you tell them it's gone. And you tell them that any future interference in my business dealings or in the affairs of the Wilkes family will be met with the full weight of every legal and financial resource I have, which, as you know, is considerable." Aldridge's pleasant smile had gone entirely. "We understand each other?" Samuel said. "We understand each other," Aldridge said tightly. Samuel straightened. "Good day, Charles." He left the club. He stood on Walnut Street for a moment in the heat, and he thought, that should have felt better than it does. It felt like solving a problem. It did not feel like solving the right problem. Because the question Aldridge had inadvertently raised, who wanted that land badly enough to engineer a forced sale, was still sitting unanswered, and Samuel Gray had learned a long time ago that unanswered questions had a habit of becoming tomorrow's crises. He went back to his office. He sent for Prescott. "The other creditors on the Wilkes note," he said when Prescott arrived. "I need to know who approached them and when." Prescott nodded. "I can find out by tomorrow." "Tonight," Samuel said. The answer came at 8 o'clock that evening, and it was worse than Samuel had expected. The man behind it was a Philadelphia industrialist named Hargrove, Martin Hargrove, who Samuel knew by reputation and by 2 brief, unpleasant interactions at industry meetings. Hargrove was older, established, the kind of man who had made his money in the previous generation and spent the current one protecting it from anyone who threatened his position at the top of the city's commercial hierarchy. Samuel Gray threatened his position, had threatened it for 3 years, with every mill he built and every contract he took and every relationship he cultivated in the city's business community. Hargrove had been watching, and when the opportunity to acquire the Wilkes Creek access, the same creek access Samuel needed for his 4th mill, had presented itself through Thomas Wilkes's debts. Hargrove had moved. He'd moved quietly through the creditors, through Aldridge, through the kind of back-channel arrangement that was entirely legal and entirely ruthless, and almost perfectly invisible until it was too late. Samuel sat with this information until 9 o'clock. Then he poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon and actually drank it this time, which he had not done since the night of the Harrington ball. Hargrove would not stop at the land. Samuel understood this clearly. A man who had spent 3 years watching a rival and had moved this deliberately when opportunity presented itself was not a man who stopped because one move failed. He would look for the next opportunity. He would find it, or create it. And unlike Aldridge, who was motivated by easy profit, Hargrove was motivated by something more durable and more dangerous. The conviction that he was entitled to the position he held, and that Samuel Gray's existence was an affront to that entitlement. Samuel needed to think. And he realized with a clarity that surprised him in its specificity, to think with Emily. He was at her door at 9:30. This was, by any standard of Philadelphia society in 1815, an entirely inappropriate hour for an unmarried man to call on an unmarried woman. And he knocked on the door anyway. Clara answered. Her eyes went wide. "Tell Miss Wilkes it's Samuel Gray," he said. "Tell her I wouldn't be here at this hour if it weren't important." Clara retreated. There was a pause. Then Emily appeared, still dressed, which told him she hadn't gone to bed either, and she looked at his face and stepped back from the door without a word. He told her about Hargrove in the parlor, without sitting, both of them standing because neither of them had thought to sit, talking quickly and quietly because her father was sleeping upstairs. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "He'll come after the mill next," she said. "Yes. The 4th mill, the new site. If he can complicate the permits or the water rights, he'll try," Samuel said. "He has connections in the city government that I've been working around for 2 years. "Can you go over him?" she asked. "State level?" He looked at her. "You know state politics?" "My father was involved in municipal government until 4 years ago," she said, with the patient tone of someone who is accustomed to being underestimated. "I attended every meeting he took notes on every conversation, and read every letter that came to this house for 15 years. I know who the important people are in this state, Mr. Gray. I know who they owe and who owes them." She met his eyes. "The question is whether any of it is still useful after the years we've had." Samuel looked at her in the dim parlor light. This woman in her practical dress, with her notebook brain and her bone-deep, honest gaze, and he thought, "I have been doing this alone for 6 years, and I cannot, at this moment, remember why." "Hargrove will also go after your reputation," she said. "That's how men like him work. When the business channels don't succeed, they find the personal angle." "My reputation is built on results," Samuel said. "It's harder to damage than—" "Catherine," Emily said quietly. He went still. "If he finds out about Catherine," she said, not looking away, "about how she died, about the timing. Men like Hargrove turn private grief into public narrative. They make it into a story about character." She paused. "I'm not saying this to alarm you. I'm saying it so you're not caught off guard." The room was very quiet. "How would he find out?" Samuel asked. "How did I find out?" she said simply. He thought about it. "You're observant." "So are people who are paid to be," she said. "And Hargrove can afford to pay them." Samuel sat down then, finally, on the edge of the settee, his forearms on his knees, looking at the floor for a moment. Not defeated, recalibrating, the way he did when a calculation had shifted, and he needed to reset from the new position. Emily sat across from him. "Tell me what you need," she said. He looked up. "I mean that," she said. "Not what you think you can ask for, what you actually need." He held her gaze. "I need someone who isn't invested in what I've built to tell me whether it's worth building." The words came out before he'd exactly decided to say them. He heard them land and felt the specific vulnerability of having said something true that he had not planned to say. Emily didn't look away. "Is that a question?" "It might be." "Then I'll answer it," she said. "The mills are worth building. The problem is that you've been building them alone, and alone you miss things. Not because you're not intelligent. You're possibly the most intelligent person I've met in terms of pure calculation. But intelligence without someone who cares about different things than you do has blind spots." "Daniel Marsh," he said. "Daniel Marsh," she agreed. "And James Holt, and the 30 others on Henderson's list." She leaned forward slightly. "You didn't see them, Samuel. Not really, until someone made you look. That's not a condemnation. That's just the limit of what one perspective can hold." He was quiet for a long moment. "You'd be a formidable business partner," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Is that what you're offering?" The word partner sat between them in the warm parlor air and expanded slowly to fill all the available space. "I don't know what I'm offering," he said honestly. "I know that 3 weeks ago I walked into the Harrington Ball as a man who had every calculation in his life settled. And I don't have a single one of them settled now." "Is that a bad thing?" she asked. He thought about it with the seriousness it deserved. "No," he said. "I don't think it is." She looked at him for a long moment, that clear, direct, unsettling look that saw exactly as much as it intended to see, and not one thing more. "Hargrove is going to move fast," she said. "He's already started." "Yes." "So are we going to sit here being honest about our feelings?" she said, with a precision that was somehow both warmer and sharper than sarcasm. "Or are we going to do something about it?" Samuel looked at her. Something in his chest did the thing it had been doing since the Harrington Ball. The thing he had been carefully not naming, because naming things made them real, and real things required decisions. He made the decision. "Both," he said. "We're going to do both." And for the first time since the Harrington Ball, Emily Wilkes smiled at him. Fully, without reservation, without the careful management she applied to everything else. It was, Samuel thought, the most undefended thing he had ever seen. And he understood, in that moment, with the clarity of a man who had built his entire life on correct calculations, that he had been wrong about what this was from the very beginning. This was not a negotiation. It was not a strategy. It was not a different calculation. It was the only thing he had wanted, without knowing it, for 6 years. The front door rattled. Both of them turned. Clara appeared in the parlor doorway, and her face was wrong, pale and tight, and carrying the specific look of someone who had opened a door and found something on the other side that they didn't have words for. "Miss Wilkes," Clara said, "there's a man. He says he has papers. Legal papers." She swallowed. "He says they're from a Judge Harmon." Emily was on her feet before Clara finished speaking. Samuel was right behind her. The man at the door was a court clerk, young, apologetic, clearly unhappy about his assignment. He held out an envelope, with the careful distance of someone delivering something they personally wanted no part of. Emily took it, opened it. Samuel watched her read. He watched the color change in her face. Not drain exactly, but shift. The way a person's face shifted when they were processing something that changed the shape of what they'd thought was settled. She handed him the paper. He read it. It was not about the land. The land was settled, signed, stamped, filed. Hargrove knew that. This was something else entirely. It was a petition, filed with Judge Harmon, contesting the legal competence of Thomas Wilkes to enter into property agreements on the grounds of his documented illness, his use of medicinal tonic, and what the petition described as demonstrated impairment of judgment. If granted, every agreement Thomas Wilkes had signed in the past 6 months, including this morning's land transfer, would be declared void. Samuel read it twice. He looked at Emily. Her face was completely still. The kind of still that came after the first wave of something hit, and you were deciding, in the seconds you had, what you were made of. "He can't win this," Samuel said. "Your father was clear-minded this morning. Webb was there. Prescott was there. Hargrove doesn't need to win it," Emily said. "He needs to tie it up in court long enough to find another angle." Her voice was perfectly level. "This is the personal narrative. This is what you said he'd do." Samuel looked at the paper in his hands. Then he folded it, set it on the hall table. "All right," he said. She looked at him. "All right," he said again, and his voice had the quality it got when he had moved past calculation into something simpler and more absolute. "Then we fight it." "How?" she said. "Every way there is," he said, "starting tonight." She looked at him for one long, clear moment, and she said, "Then we'd better get started." Prescott arrived at the Wilkes house at 11 o'clock that night. Samuel had sent for him the moment Emily said those 4 words, "Then we'd better get started." And Prescott, who had worked for Samuel Gray long enough to know that a midnight summons meant something real had shifted, came without complaint and with his case already packed. Webb arrived 20 minutes later. Thomas Wilkes, who had apparently not been as deeply asleep as anyone assumed, appeared in the parlor doorway in his dressing gown at 11:30, with the expression of a man who had heard enough through the ceiling to understand that waiting upstairs was no longer an option. "Sit down, Papa," Emily said. "Tell me," he said. She told him, clean and direct, the way she did everything. No softening, no delay, just the facts in the order they'd arrived. Hargrove's petition, Judge Harmon, the argument about competency. Thomas Wilkes listened to every word without moving. Then he sat down in his chair. Not the collapse of a defeated man, but the deliberate settling of someone who intended to think clearly and needed to be still to do it. "He's calling me incompetent," Thomas said. "He's calling the signing into question," Emily said. "It's a legal maneuver. It's not about you." "It is entirely about me," Thomas said, with a sharpness that reminded Samuel, forcefully, of his daughter at the Harrington ball. "He is standing in front of a judge and saying Thomas Wilkes doesn't have the mind left to sign his own name. That is about me." Nobody argued with him, because he was right. Webb spread his papers on the parlor table. "The petition has 3 grounds," he said, in the careful voice of a lawyer who had learned that precision was kindness in moments like this. "Illness, the tonic, and a reference to 2 decisions Mr. Wilkes made in the past year that Hargrove is characterizing as demonstrably poor judgment." "Which decisions?" Thomas asked. Webb hesitated. "Which decisions, Edgar?" Thomas said. "The Cary shipyard investment," Webb said, "and a loan he extended to a man named Briggs 18 months ago that was never repaid." The room went quiet. Thomas was looking at the table. His jaw was set. "Both of those were mistakes," he said. "I know they were mistakes. I knew it when I made them. Mr. Wilkes, I made them because I was frightened," Thomas said, with the flat, clear honesty of a man who is done protecting himself from his own history. "I was frightened of losing everything, and I made 2 bad decisions trying to prevent it, and I lost everything anyway." He looked up. His eyes were bright and sharp. "That's not incompetence. That's fear. Every man in this city has done the same thing. The difference is, most of them had enough money left over that nobody noticed. Samuel looked at Webb. "Can we counter the petition before Harmon rules on it?" "We can file a response," Webb said. "We'd need character witnesses, a medical statement from his physician, and testimony from everyone present at this morning's signing attesting to his clarity of mind." "That's Prescott, Webb, and me," Samuel said. "And me," Emily said. "Emily," Thomas started. "And me," she said again, in the tone that closed arguments. "The judge can have my statement about every conversation I've had with my father in the past 6 months. Let Hargrove's lawyers try to paint a man as incompetent in front of his own daughter's testimony." She looked at Webb. "How long do we have?" "Harmon will convene a hearing," Webb said. "Given the filing, likely within 4 days." "Then we have 4 days," Emily said. Samuel was watching her. She was standing at the parlor table with her hands flat on the surface and her weight forward. The same posture she'd had at the Harrington ball. The same absolute certainty in her own ground. He thought, 4 weeks ago, I walked into a party and found the most inconvenient woman I had ever met. He thought, I have never in my life been so grateful to be inconvenienced. "There's one more thing," Prescott said, and something in his voice made everyone look at him. He had been quiet until now, processing, the way careful men processed. "The 2 grounds that are hardest to argue, the illness and the tonic, those are real. Judge Harmon knows Thomas Wilkes is unwell. He'll have seen it. And tonic use, even prescribed, is something courts view with particular—" "Then we remove the tonic," Thomas said. Everyone looked at him. "Starting tonight," he said. "I stopped taking it." "Papa, the doctor—" "The doctor gives it to me for the pain and the sleep," Thomas said. "Neither of those is worth losing the only thing I have left to leave you." He looked at Emily directly. "I stopped tonight. By the time the hearing convenes, 4 days clean is 4 days they can't point to." Emily looked at her father for a long moment. Her expression did the thing Samuel had learned to watch for. The thing where she was feeling something large and was deciding, without drama, what to do with it. "All right," she said quietly. "All right, Papa." Thomas nodded once. "Good. Now somebody get me something to eat. I haven't had a full appetite in 6 weeks, and tonight I find I'm hungry." Clara, who had been standing in the doorway for the past 20 minutes, taking in the entire proceedings with her hands clasped and her eyes wide, made a sound that was something between a laugh and a sob, and went immediately to the kitchen. The next 4 days moved like water over rock, fast, cold, and relentless. Samuel filed the counter-response with Webb by morning. Prescott gathered affidavits. Emily wrote her own statement in one sitting, 4 pages, without stopping, in the handwriting of someone who knew exactly what they wanted to say, and had been waiting for the right form in which to say it. Samuel read it when she handed it to him. He read it twice. "This is the clearest piece of legal writing I've seen from anyone who isn't a lawyer," he said. "My father taught me to write by having me take notes on his correspondence," she said. 15 years of other people's arguments teaches you what a good one looks like." "You should have been a lawyer." "Women can't be lawyers," she said. "So I do it from the side, and I do it better." He handed the statement back. Their fingers didn't quite touch. He noticed. She noticed that he noticed. Neither of them said anything about it, because there was work to do. And they were both, it turned out, people who finished their work before they attended to other things. On the second day, something unexpected happened. Margaret Holt appeared at Samuel's office, not with James, alone, in her good dress, with the particular expression of a woman who had made a decision and was committed to seeing it through, regardless of how it sat with her. Samuel came out to the front room himself. "Mrs. Holt," he said. "I heard about the court petition," she said. James started school Monday. He came home and told me about it for 45 minutes straight." She paused. "I'm not a woman who forgets what she's owed or what's been done to her. But I'm also not a woman who stands by when something fair is being threatened." She held out an envelope. "That's a statement, from me, about what I saw at your mill when I came to collect James's last pay. About the changes, about the school arrangement, about—" She stopped. "About the kind of man I think you might be working on becoming." Samuel took the envelope. He looked at it, looked at her. "Mrs. Holt," he said, "I don't know how to—" "Don't," she said. "It's not for you. It's for Miss Wilkes. Because she came and she listened and she did something." She turned to go, stopped. "And tell her James wants to be a school teacher. He decided yesterday." She left. Samuel stood in his front room for a moment, holding the envelope. Then he put on his coat and walked to Emily's house. He handed it to her without a word. She opened it, read it. And this time, the thing that crossed her face wasn't the careful management of a large feeling. It was just the feeling, clean and full and entirely unguarded. And she pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for 1 second and breathed. "He wants to be a school teacher," Samuel said. Emily laughed. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh, a full, unguarded sound, entirely unlike the careful, precise version of herself she showed the world, and it hit him square in the chest, like something he hadn't known he'd been waiting for. "Of course he does," she said. On the 4th day, they went to the hearing. The courtroom was not crowded. Hargrove had not publicized the petition. This was not a performance. It was a mechanism. And mechanisms worked best without an audience. He was present with his 2 lawyers and Aldridge, who sat 1 row back with the expression of a man who had reconsidered his position and had not quite worked out how to show it without admitting he'd ever taken it. Thomas Wilkes walked in on his own. Emily had offered her arm at the door. He had taken it, pressed her hand once, and then let go and walked the rest of the way under his own authority, which Samuel thought was one of the braver things he'd seen in a long time. The counter-response was filed. The affidavits were submitted. Margaret Holt's statement was submitted. Emily's statement was submitted. Webb read portions aloud in the careful, measured voice of a man who understood that some documents worked best when heard. Then Judge Harmon looked at Thomas Wilkes directly and said, "Mr. Wilkes, I'd like to hear from you." Thomas stood. He was thinner than he'd been in his years of health, and the 4 days without the tonic had left shadows under his eyes and a slight tremor in his hands that he controlled by standing very still. "Your Honor," he said, "I've made mistakes. I'll stand in front of any court in this state and say so plainly, because I believe that a man who can name his mistakes clearly is demonstrating exactly the opposite of incompetence." He paused. "I signed that land agreement because I understood it, negotiated it, and believed it was the best available outcome for my family. I had my lawyer present. I had the opposing party's lawyer present. I discussed every condition personally, and I insisted on 2 provisions that were not in the original offer." He looked at the judge without flinching. "If Mr. Hargrove would like to argue that a man who negotiates his own conditions is incompetent, I invite him to explain the logic of that to your court." The room was quiet. Harmon looked at Hargrove's table. Hargrove's lead attorney stood. They argued for 20 minutes. Competence standards, medical precedent, the tonic. Webb countered each point with the precision of someone who had spent 3 nights preparing exactly this counter. Then Harmon held up his hand. "I've heard enough," he said. The silence was absolute. "The petition is denied," Harmon said. "The land transfer of July 14, 1815, stands as filed." The parties are advised that further frivolous petitions on settled matters will be treated accordingly." He looked at Hargrove's table, with the expression of a judge who had seen this kind of maneuvering before and was not impressed by it. "We're adjourned." The gavel came down. Emily's hand found Samuel's arm. Not a grip, just a touch, the back of her fingers against his sleeve for one moment. He covered her hand with his without looking at her, because some things didn't need to be looked at, to be acknowledged. Thomas Wilkes exhaled. It was the longest breath Samuel had ever heard a man take. Hargrove left without speaking to anyone. Aldridge followed him, and his expression, as he passed Samuel's row, contained several complicated things, and none of them were pleasant for him. Samuel let him pass without a word. Some victories were quiet, and that was fine. Outside, in the July heat, Thomas shook Webb's hand, and then Prescott's hand, and then Samuel's hand. The same firm grip as before, longer than required, carrying the same things it hadn't said out loud. "Come to supper," Thomas said. "Tonight. Both of you." He looked at Prescott and Webb. "All of you. Clara will manage something."
"Papa, Clara has enough to—"
"Clara will manage something," Thomas said, with the first edge of his old authority, warm and stubborn and entirely himself. "I haven't sat at a full table in 6 months. I intend to tonight." They sat at a full table that evening. It was not elegant. Clara had done what she could with what there was, and what there was simple and good, and the conversation moved around the table with the ease of people who had been through something together and come out the other side still standing. Thomas asked Samuel questions, real questions, about the mills and the fourth site and the plans for what came next. Samuel answered them without the careful calibration he used in business settings, and Thomas listened with the focused attention of a man who had once understood industry well enough to invest in it, and wanted to remember that part of himself. At some point, Emily caught Samuel's eye across the table and held it for a moment, just long enough to say, without saying, that she saw what was happening between the two men, and she was glad of it. He looked back at her and said, without words, that he was, too. After supper, Thomas excused himself early, not because the evening was over, but because 4 days without the tonic had cost him, and he was honest about what he needed in a way that Samuel had begun to understand was one of the man's most essential qualities. "Good night, Mr. Gray," Thomas said at the parlor door. "Good night, sir." Thomas looked at him for a moment. "My daughter trusts very few people," he said. "I've watched her trust grow more careful every year for the past 3 years. I want you to understand what it means that she trusted you with what she told you." He paused. "Don't be careless with it." "I won't," Samuel said. Thomas nodded, went upstairs. The house was quiet. Samuel stood in the parlor, and Emily came back from the hallway where she'd walked her father to the stairs, and they were alone in the room the way they'd been alone in his office 2 weeks ago. But everything between them had changed in those 2 weeks, in ways that neither of them had planned, and neither of them was inclined to undo. "Hargrove will try again," Emily said. "Not soon. Harmon put him on notice." "Not soon," she agreed, "but eventually." "Eventually," Samuel said. "We'll deal with it then." The word "we" sat in the room between them, the same way partner had sat between them in his office, expanding slowly, taking up the available space, requiring an acknowledgement. "Samuel," she said. "Emily?" She looked at him with the clear, direct gaze that he had stopped trying to outlast weeks ago, because it could not be outlasted. It simply waited until you were honest, and then it met you there. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Ask it." "What are you doing?" she said. "Not the mills, not Hargrove, not the note or the land or any of the rest of it." She looked at him steadily.
What are you doing with me?
He held her gaze for a long moment. He had been asked this question, in various forms, by various people, throughout his adult life. He had always had an answer. The answer had always been some version of nothing, or business, or the coldest version, which was simply silence that let the asker draw their own conclusions. He did not have that answer now. What he had instead was the truth, which he had been moving toward for 4 weeks through arguments and milliards and legal hearings and late-night parlors, and which had apparently decided to arrive all at once, without warning, in the form of a woman looking at him across a supper table, asking him to say plainly what they both already knew. "I'm not going to be careless with you," he said. She waited. "I'm also not going to pretend this is something simpler than it is," he said, "because I don't think either of us would respect that." He took one step toward her, one deliberate, unhurried step. "I've been alone for 6 years. I built things to fill the space. You walked into a ballroom and told me, in front of everyone who mattered to your future, that what I was building had a cost I hadn't counted. And you were right." He stopped. "You've been right about most things. That's not comfortable for a man who has spent 6 years certain he had the correct calculations." "No," she said quietly. "I imagine it isn't." "I want to keep doing this," he said. "Working, arguing, being wrong in front of someone who'll tell me so. Building something that doesn't have the blind spots I've had." He looked at her. "With you, if you're willing." The room was perfectly still. "That's the least romantic proposal I've ever heard," she said. He almost smiled. "It's not a proposal."
What is it?
"It's a beginning," he said. "A proposal is something else. A proposal I intend to make properly, when your father is stronger and the legal business is settled, and we've had enough time to be certain." "Certain of what?" "That you want this," he said. "Not just the cause, not just the work. This." He held her gaze. "Me." Emily Wilkes looked at Samuel Gray across the quiet parlor of her father's house, and she thought about every calculation she'd made in the past 4 weeks. Every decision that had seemed like one thing and turned out to be another. Every moment she had told herself she was doing this for the land, or for the children, or for principle. And every moment she had known, underneath all of that she was also doing it because she wanted to be in the same room as this man, and she hadn't wanted to admit it. "Samuel," she said, "I walked up to you at the Harrington ball." He looked at her. "I told myself it was because I was angry," she said. "I was angry. But I had been angry about your mills for 2 years, and I had never walked up to anyone about it before." She held his gaze. "I walked up to you because you were the kind of man who could be walked up to. And I knew that the moment I saw you standing there, before I said a single word." He was very still. "I've been certain for a while," she said. "I've just been waiting to see if you were." He closed the remaining distance between them, not quickly, deliberately, the way he did everything that mattered, giving her time to hold her ground or step back. And she held her ground the way she always held it. He took her hand, not her fingers, not a formal gesture, her whole hand, her right hand, the one that held the notebook and the pencil, and had written 4 pages of the clearest testimony Webb had ever submitted. And he held it the way you held something that was both strong enough to take care of itself and precious enough to be careful with. "One thing at a time," he said. She looked up at him. "That's mine. That's what I said." "I know," he said. "I've been thinking about it ever since." And Emily Wilkes, who had stood in front of the most powerful man in Philadelphia, with nothing but conviction and a worn silk dress, and told him the truth about what he was doing, stood now in the quiet of her father's house and felt something she had stopped believing she was allowed to feel. The solid, unambiguous weight of being known by someone exactly as she was, and chosen anyway. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried. But she tightened her hand around his, and he felt it, and neither of them needed to say what it meant. 3 months later, in the cool of an October morning, Daniel Marsh came home from school and told his mother he'd learned to read 3 new words. At the Millbrook facility, 31 names on a ledger had become 22, and falling as the school program expanded, and Henderson, cheerful, thorough Henderson, sent weekly reports that Samuel now read all the way through, every time, without exception. Martin Hargrove filed nothing further. Judge Harmon's warning had weight, and Hargrove was, above all, a practical man. Thomas Wilkes was stronger. Not well. He would not be fully well again, and all of them knew it. But stronger and present, and seated at a full table 3 nights a week with people who had earned their place at it. And Samuel Gray, who had built 3 mills from borrowed money and grief and the sheer unrelenting force of a will that had never once bent, sat in the parlor of the Wilkes house on a Tuesday evening in October and looked at the woman across from him. This direct, inconvenient, notebook-keeping, truth-telling woman who had walked up to him at a party and changed every calculation he had, and said, plainly and without ceremony, exactly what he'd promised he would say when the time was right. She said yes before he finished the sentence. Not because she was certain life would be easy, or that Hargrove would stay quiet forever, or that the world they were building wouldn't cost them both things they hadn't yet counted. She said yes because she had learned, in the year of her family's undoing, that security was not what you were born into, or what you inherited, or what you managed to protect from the things that came for it. Security was this: a person beside you who looked at what you were honestly and built alongside you anyway. They had looked at each other honestly from the very beginning. Everything they built after that was real and lasting and entirely their own.